A scarred old lion who had never trusted humans suddenly began blocking the same patrol truck, day after day, as if begging the weary ranger inside to follow him. Only when the man finally stepped out of his safe routine did they reach the truth between them. A lion cub hanging on to life in a steel snare. From that moment on, the survival of that small, trembling body depended on something neither of them believed in, an uneasy, fragile trust between the wild and the human world. For as long as anyone at Savannah Ridge could remember, the big male with the dark mane ruled the eastern edge of the reserve. The rangers called him Khosi, the king, because no other lion lasted long in his shadow. When he walked, the grass seemed to part for him. Scars crossed his nose and shoulder like old pale threads, reminders of fights he had won and storms he had survived. Khosi's world was made of smells and sounds, the sweetness of antelope on the wind, the dry rasp of grass against his flanks, the distant rumble of thunder beyond the hills. And sometimes, from the border where the wild met the wire, came another smell he knew too well: metal, oil, and that sharp, bitter sting of something that did not belong. Human. He had learned about that smell as a young lion. A truck, a flash of light, a sting in his hip, and then the slow, heavy darkness of drugs pulling him under. When he woke, the world had shifted a little. There was a new fence, a new line where the grass ended and the strange scent of people began. Since that day, Khosi had kept his distance. The rumble of engines meant trouble. The upright figures who moved in the hot light were not part of his kingdom. On the other side of that invisible line, Mandla guided his patrol truck along the dusty tracks, day after day, year after year. He had been a ranger for more than 2 decades, long enough to watch young lions rise and fall, long enough to see tourists come and go, chasing photographs and stories. His job was simpler and harder than that. He was there to keep the rules. Mandla had a saying for the new recruits who arrived with wide eyes and soft hearts. If you love these animals, he would tell them, you let them stay wild. No petting, no feeding, no selfies. They laughed at the last word, but he meant every part of it. Sometimes, early in the morning or late in the afternoon, he would see Khosi at a distance, standing on a low rise, mane catching the light like a dark storm cloud. Mandla would slow the truck and watch through his binoculars. Khosi would turn his head just enough to show he had seen the vehicle, then look away again, dismissing it. 2 guardians of 2 different worlds, each convinced the other should stay exactly where it was. The night it happened was moonless, the kind of dark that pressed close to the ground and swallowed shapes whole. Khosi moved ahead of his small pride, a steady shadow among softer ones. Naledi walked behind him, flanks brushing the tall grass, and between them trotted their youngest, a sturdy little male they had brought through the last dry season. Mandla would have called the cub Tau if he had known him, the lion of hope, but to Khosi he was simply his son, the future that walked on unsure paws. They were skirting the far edge of their range, close to the wire where the smells of human and dust and metal always sat heavy. Tonight the air held something else as well, a faint sweetness of antelope drifting from beyond the boundary. Hunger pulled them forward. The dry months had been long. Every hunt was a question with no promise in it. Tau was curious, as young lions always are. He nosed at every clump of grass, patted at beetles that scurried past, tested his growing strength in silly pounces at nothing. One moment he was beside Naledi's hip, the next he had bounded a few lengths ahead, following a scent only he seemed to care about. Khosi heard the light rustle of his steps, then a sharp metallic twang that did not belong to the night. The cub's cry came an instant later, high and broken and full of terror. Khosi spun and charged toward the sound, Naledi right behind him. They found Tau thrashing in a patch of low brush, One hind leg caught in a loop of thin, shining wire buried under the grass. Each time he kicked, the wire tightened, biting deeper into skin and muscle. The air filled with the harsh smell of fear and the faint copper trace of blood. Khosi lunged forward and tried to tear at the wire with his teeth, but it would not yield like thorn or root. The more he pulled, the more Tao cried out, until Naledi growled low in his ear, a warning and a plea both. Khosi stopped, chest heaving, eyes burning in the dark. Somewhere beyond the fence, far off but clear, came the distant rumble of an engine and the ghost of that old bitter scent, human, metal, and something that had once meant sleep and pain. He stood over his trapped son, caught between everything he had learned to fear and the one life he could not bear to lose, while the night around them held its breath. By the time the eastern sky paled, Tao's cries had turned to small, ragged sounds that came only when he tried to move. The wire had cut through fur and skin, leaving the legs swollen and hot. Naledi lay as close as she dared without brushing the snare, her nose against her son's neck, licking his face whenever his eyes fluttered open. Khosi paced in a tight circle around them, tail low, every instinct he owned screaming to do something, anything, and finding no answer in tooth or claw. Dawn brought cooler air and new smells on the wind. Somewhere beyond the fence, the day of the humans was beginning. Khosi caught the faint echo of an engine turning over, the familiar growl of a patrol truck starting its route. He froze, head lifted, ears forward. That sound had always meant one thing to him: trouble. But now, with Tao's breathing shallow and uneven, it also meant something else: power. Not the kind he carried in his muscles, but the kind that had put up fences and dug wells and moved animals without killing them. He looked down at his son once more. Tao's eyes were dull, unfocused, his throat working as he swallowed against thirst and fear. Naledi met Khosi's gaze with a low rumble that held both warning and trust. She could not follow him beyond their broken circle of grass. She would stay with the cub. The choice, terrible and simple, rested on Khosi alone. With a final sweep of his tongue over Tao's flank, Khosi turned and began to move. He did not run. The ground between the snare and the dirt road was full of scents that needed reading: hyena, jackal, old blood, the faint trace of other lions that had passed in the night. He walked with the steady, measured pace of a lion on patrol, but his mind was fixed on that growing sound: the truck, somewhere ahead, rolling toward the far edge of his world. When the vehicle finally came into view, raising a thin cloud of dust in the morning light, Khosi did something no wild king should have done. He stepped out from the grass and planted himself squarely in the center of the road. The truck slowed, its engine dropping to a low murmur. Behind the glass, he saw the shape of the same man he had watched for years, hands on the wheel, face drawn in a puzzled frown. The two males stared at one another across a few yards of baked earth and metal. Then Khosi turned his head toward the distant scrub where Tao lay, took a few slow steps in that direction, and stopped. He looked back at the truck, eyes steady, as if waiting to see whether the guardian of the other world could understand what the king of this one was trying, clumsily and desperately, to say. The first time, Mandla told himself it was a strange coincidence. A big male on the road was unusual, yes, but lions had their moods and their reasons. He let the truck idle, watched Khosi stand there a moment longer, then eased forward until the lion finally shifted aside with a low, irritated flick of his tail. As the vehicle rolled past, Mandla glanced in the mirror and saw Khosi still staring after him, head turned toward the scrub where the land rose and fell in gentle folds. By the time he finished his loop and returned an hour later, the road was empty. The second time happened 3 days on, under a sky washed pale by late morning heat. Sifo, the youngest ranger on the team, was in the passenger seat that day, chattering about a broken fence post and a herd of impala that had slipped through the night before. Mandla had half an ear on the story and half on the rhythm of the engine until a shape stepped out from the grass ahead and forced him to brake. There was Khosi again, broad chest filling the track, mane lifting slightly in the breeze as if he had been standing there, waiting. "Ish, that's your lion," Sifo said, leaning forward. "Maybe he thinks you're family now." "Lions don't think like that," Mandla muttered, but his fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Khosi paced once around the front of the truck, pausing by Mandla's window long enough for the older man to see the worn lines of his face, the pale scar along his muzzle. Then the lion walked a few strides down the road, turned toward the same distant tangle of brush, and stopped. His whole body seemed to lean in that direction. He looked back over his shoulder at the truck, tail hanging low, not in threat, but in something that, if Mandla had believed in such things, might have been worry. They sat there for a long moment, engine humming softly, the air inside the cab suddenly too still. Finally, Mandla shook his head, as if pushing away a thought he did not want. He tapped the horn twice. The short, sharp beeps broke the spell. Khosi flinched, then gave a single, deep grunt and stepped off the track, disappearing once more into the tall grass. After that, it became a pattern Mandla could not quite ignore, even as he tried. Every second or third patrol, somewhere along that eastern stretch, Khosi would appear. Sometimes he was already on the road when the truck came around a curve. Other times, he emerged from the grass just in time to block their way. His behavior was always the same: a brief, unwavering stare at the vehicle, a slow movement toward that distant patch of land, a pause, and then that backward glance. At night, when paperwork kept him late in the small office by the radio, Mandla caught himself tracing the route with a blunt finger on the map, circling the place where the lion always seemed to point. He would sit back and remind himself of his own rule: if you love these animals, you keep your distance. Out there, he told himself, Khosi was just being a lion. Whatever trouble the animal had found, it was not his job to read meaning into a stare. Still, when the next dawn came and the truck's headlights cut through the thin mist over the savannah, Mandla found his eyes searching the empty road ahead a little earlier than usual, listening for more than just the sound of the engine and the birds waking in the grass. The day that broke Mandla's rule began under a heavy sky. Low clouds pressed down on Savannah Ridge, turning the early light a dull gray. The wind smelled of dust and rain that had not yet fallen. Mandla drove alone that morning, the passenger seat empty, the radio quiet, except for the occasional burst of static. He liked it that way on days like this. Fewer voices meant fewer chances to doubt himself. The road along the eastern boundary was rutted and familiar. He could have driven it with his eyes closed, counting each bend and dip by memory. Even so, as the truck rolled over the last rise, he felt that small tightening in his chest he had come to recognize. His eyes were already searching the track ahead for a dark shape. Khosi was there, waiting. The lion stood in the center of the road, broader than ever against the dim light. His mane was stirred by the restless wind, but the rest of him was still, as if the world had narrowed to the band of dirt between them. Mandla eased his foot off the accelerator. The truck slowed, engine dropping to a soft growl, then idled to a stop a few yards from the lion. Up close, Khosi did not look like a legend or a story told around a campfire. He looked tired, the fur along his flanks was ruffled, and there was dust on his paws as if he had been pacing for hours. His eyes met Mandla's through the windshield, steady, unblinking, holding him in place. "Move along, my friend," Mandla said under his breath, though the windows were closed. "This isn't how we do things." But Khosi did not move aside. He took a slow step toward the truck, then another, until Mandla could see the rise and fall of his ribs. Then he turned carefully and walked down the track, away from the vehicle. After a few paces, he left the road, heading into the grass toward that same patch of broken land he had pointed to again and again. At the edge of the brush, he stopped and looked back, tail hanging low, the tip twitching once. Mandla sat very still, hands on the wheel, the engine's vibration running up through his arms. He heard his own words echo in his head. If you love these animals, you let them stay wild. You do not follow them into their world. You do not imagine meaning in what they do. A deeper silence settled over the cab, thicker than the ticking of the cooling dashboard or the distant call of a hornbill. Outside, Khosi waited. Mandla reached forward and turned off the ignition. The engine died, leaving only the wind and his own heartbeat in his ears. For a long moment he stared at the lion's back, at the line between the safety of the truck and the unknown beyond it. Then, with a slow, almost reluctant motion, he opened the door and stepped down onto the hard earth, choosing, for the first time in his career, to cross a line he himself had drawn. Khosi moved ahead with a slow, heavy stride, never so far that Mandla lost sight of him, never so close that the distance between them disappeared. The grass brushed against the ranger's boots, whispering over his trouser legs as he walked, rifle held low but ready. The truck sat behind them on the road like a forgotten shell. In front, the land felt different, too quiet, as if the usual morning chorus had drawn back to watch. Every few paces, Khosi glanced over his shoulder, checking that the man was still there. His ears flicked at the faint crackle of the radio on Mandla's shoulder, at the clink of metal against leather. These were sounds he had been taught to avoid. Today he accepted them, the same way he accepted the thud of his own heart, pounding harder with each step toward the place where his son lay. They crested a small rise and dropped into a shallow hollow choked with low thorn and scrub. Here the smells were stronger, old fear, fresh. Blood, the sour scent of rust. Khosi slowed, then stopped beside a tangle of brush that looked no different from any other at first glance. He stood there, head held low, and let out a soft, rumbling sound that carried more than volume could. Mandla circled wide, keeping his distance until he could see into the heart of the thicket. When he did, the breath went out of him. Tao lay on his side, one hind leg pulled at a strange angle by a loop of thin wire anchored to a buried stake. The flesh above the paw was swollen and raw where the snare had bitten in, fur darkened and matted, but the cub's chest still rose and fell in shallow, stubborn breaths. Naledi was pressed close to him, her body taut as a bowstring. She lifted her head at Mandla's approach, lips peeling back just enough to show the edge of her teeth. "It's all right, Mama," Mandla murmured, more to steady himself than her. His eyes flicked to Khosi. The big male had moved a step to the side, muscles bunched, ready to spring between man and cub if he had to. Yet he did not charge. He only watched, trusting and warning in the same still gaze. Mandla thumbed the radio, voice low but urgent as he called in coordinates and asked for the mobile vet team. While he spoke, a new sound slipped into the hollow, the uneven giggle of hyenas on the wind, catching the scent of weakness and blood. He turned, spotting their shapes on the ridge, gray and brown against the dull sky. They were keeping their distance for now, circling, weighing the risk of a meal guarded by lions and a man with a rifle. Mandla raised the gun and fired a single shot into the air. The crack rolled across the land like sudden thunder. The hyenas flinched and scattered, but he knew they would not go far. Behind him, Tao gave a small, broken whimper. Khosi flicked an ear at the sound, then looked once more at the ranger. A king forced to stand aside and let another creature's tools decide whether his son would live. The vet truck arrived with a rattle of wheels and the smell of medicine. Dr. Grace Allen climbed down first, her gray-streaked hair pulled back, her eyes already scanning the scene. Behind her, Two assistants unpacked a metal case and a long dart gun. Mandla stepped aside to let her look through the thicket, his hand making a small, steadying motion even though she had seen snares before. "Still breathing," she said softly. "That's something." Khosi watched from a few strides away, muscles tight, ears tipped forward. He did not understand the words, but he understood the way the humans moved. Slow, deliberate, never turning their backs fully on him. When Grace raised the dart gun, he rumbled in his chest, a sound that made one of the assistants swallow hard. "Easy, old man," Mandla murmured toward the lion, though he knew Khosi owed him nothing. "She's here for him." The dart struck Tao's shoulder with a small thump. The cub flinched, then grew still as the drug took hold. Naledi tensed, but Khosi stepped closer to her, brushing her flank with his shoulder. Together they stood and watched while the humans cut the wire, cleaned the wound, wrapped the leg in white cloth that smelled of sharp, biting liquid. Finally, with a low grunt of effort, the assistants lifted Tao onto a stretcher and carried him toward the waiting truck. That was when Khosi broke his stillness. He surged forward, a single step that sent dust fretting, a warning growl climbing out of his chest. Grace froze. Mandla raised a hand, not to the rifle this time, but toward the lion. "He goes with them," Mandla said quietly, though he knew Khosi would not understand the promise. "Or he doesn't go at all." For a long heartbeat, the world hung on what the lion would do. Then Khosi stopped, great head lowering. He let the humans pass, his eyes following every movement as they slid the stretcher into the back of the truck and closed the door. When the engine started, he did something no one there had ever seen. He trotted alongside as the vehicle rolled away, keeping pace until the road bent toward the cluster of low buildings that made up the field station. There, at the edge of a scent line, he remembered all too well, he stopped. In the days that followed, the routine of Savannah Ridge changed in small, quiet ways. Tao lay in a shaded pen behind the clinic, leg bandaged, drifting in and out of shallow sleep. To him, the world was a blur of strange smells, disinfectant, canvas, the cool rubber of a water bowl. But every so often, on the wind that slipped through the mesh, came something familiar. The dry, sun-baked scent of Khosi and Naledi waiting somewhere just beyond the far fence. Each evening, as the heat bled out of the day, Mandla would see a dark shape on a low rise beyond the station, motionless against the sky. Khosi never came closer than that ridge, but he was always there, a silent silhouette watching the place where humans had taken his son. He could not hunt the snare or fight the bandage on Tao's leg. All his strength, all his old victories, meant nothing here. So for the first time in his life, the king of the eastern boundary did the hardest thing a hunter can do. He waited. When Grace finally told him the words he had been waiting to hear, Mandla felt the relief in his shoulders before he understood it in his mind. "He'll keep the leg," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "He'll always limp a little, but he's young. He'll learn around it." Outside the clinic, the afternoon light lay warm over the pens. Tao stood at the far side of his enclosure, thinner now, but steady on 3 good legs and 1 bandaged one. He sniffed at the breeze, ears pricked, as if listening past the wire for something he could not yet see. Mandla walked to the edge of the compound and raised his binoculars toward the low ridge beyond. As he had every evening, he found Khosi's dark shape there, carved against the sky. The big lion was not alone this time. A second form lay beside him, smaller and sleek. Naledi. They had waited together long enough. Later that week, just after dawn, the field station grew quiet in a different way. The generator hummed, the birds called, but the usual clatter of buckets and voices by Tao's pen was gone. Instead, Grace, Mandla, and one assistant stood by the gate of a larger holding area that opened toward the wild, a stretch of grass and scrub backed by the very ridge where Khosi so often stood. Tao limped out first, testing each step, ears flicking with uncertainty. The wind brought him a rush of smells, dust, old medicine, and, underneath it all, the deep sun-baked scent of home. On the ridge, Khosi lifted his head. He saw the small, pale-maned shape below and let out a low, rolling call that carried across the distance like a drumbeat. Naledi answered, already moving downslope. Tao froze, then turned toward the sound, tail twitching in a way that was half kitten and half lion. The distance between them closed in a handful of heartbeats. Naledi reached him first, rubbing her head along his neck, breathing him in. Khosi came after, slower, his limp almost invisible under the weight of the moment. He circled his son once, touching nose to flank, to mane, to the bandaged leg, as if counting each part. Then he lifted his head toward the humans by the fence. From where he stood, Mandla could not read expression in a lion's face. But something in the angle of Khosi's gaze, in the way he did not turn away at once, felt like an acknowledgement, not friendship, not gratitude in the way people used the word, but a simple fact shared between old creatures who had both seen too much. Months later, when the bandages were gone and the dry season had turned, Mandla drove his usual route along the eastern boundary. The fence line shimmered in the heat. Antelope moved in the distance. And there, on a rise beside the road, a young male sat watching the truck pass, one hind leg planted a little carefully, a faint pale scar circling the ankle. Mandla slowed just a fraction. The young lion, Tao now grown into his name, did not move to block the road as his father once had. He only watched, calm and alert, as the vehicle rolled by. For a brief moment their eyes met. Then Tao turned his head toward the open land behind him, where Khosi's deeper call was already rising on the wind. The truck went on, following its track. The lions went on, following theirs. Between them lay the same old fence and a new, invisible line, no longer drawn only by fear, but by a memory they would carry, each in their own way, for as long as they walked that shared edge of the wild. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.